Good to see you. It's been pouring down with rain, so atmospherically the pressure might be a bit strange on the way round. Hey everyone, Carol Sue. Dawn, let me stop here for a second. Hey Tish, Hans, Mike, Leah, Roberta, Jan Christine, MB. I'm going to get to a better signal area. Once we go down Old Bond Street, then New Bond Street, we should be okay. We're going to talk about, we're going to eventually end up at a plaque to him outside John Lewis off Oxford Street. We are on Piccadilly. Right in front of us, the centre of the screen, is the Ritz. We'll take a little turn down here. Now, I could have done this tour in many different ways. But today we have a train strike in London. So I can't do that. And I can't travel as far as I wanted to. I wanted originally to go to Harrow on the Hill. It's taken me 2.5 hours from my home in southeast London just to get central London. And then it started pouring with rain. But that's okay. Anyone that saw my Alfred Hitchcock tour, I spent most of that in Shoreditch, underneath the canopy and awning in Shoreditch, and then I made a run for it. Yeah, the buses are working, Helen G, but that's what I did. I took 5 buses to get here today. 2.5 hours. I thought I was being clever. I could have probably cycled, but then the rain started as well. Thank you, Trist. Thank you. So I'm not telling you this to make tips. But I was thinking it does help. Yeah, Shoshana, I can't get to Harrow on the Hill today. It took me 2.5 hours to get from southeast London to central London. I can't get to Harrow on the Hill. I'm so sorry. But we're on Old Bond Street, and we're going to talk about Lord Byron. We're going to eventually end up at a plaque designating the area that he was born, more or less the house that he was born. We call him Lord Byron. It might be another day, Shoshana. I've travelled a long way to do this. I couldn't get there. Literally couldn't get there. I don't want to do 5 hours. Thank you, Shoshana. I will do that. And I have pictures of Harrow and Harrow School, and I'll talk a bit about it on the way. But I suppose after these few minutes, I should talk about Lord Byron. We call him Lord Byron. Now, a lot of people, Lord Lloyd Webber, let's say, this theatre impresario, we call him Andrew Lloyd Webber. But George Gordon Byron, we seem to forget the George Gordon. George Gordon Byron, in very simple terms, was a romantic poet. Jane has said, should have been going to London today, looked at alternative travel arrangements. Well, I don't like to cancel. The only time I will cancel is for a medical emergency or a family emergency. And literally, time-wise, you can't do it, but I made it in. George Gordon Byron, he was a romantic poet in the early 1800s, best known for two main works, but he wrote so many others. Don Juan, or as he called it, Don Juan, because it rhymes with true one. Now, I'm not a fan of people who have snobbery when it comes to poetry or writing, literature snobbery, or just in general, people who say, you should pronounce it like this, or I think you got that wrong. Poetry should be for everyone, just like I think that sculpture is art in the open air. It's up to you how you feel about it. But he rhymed true one. He was clever enough. He had a great education. I think he was being satirical. He was trying to be funny. But he's best known for these narrative poems, Don Juan and Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. Byron was known for personal exploits, very notorious excesses, and a lot of people seem to mention this, a lame club foot. And also he died like quite a few eccentric. He's not remembered As I said, if you've got sound and no picture, I am not saying anything until we get to a signal that you can see everything and hear everything. I've not said anything in the past 1 minute, so don't worry about it. We've taken a different route. So anyone that's just joined because of traffic problems with a train strike today, and it's taken me a while to get in, and obviously because of weather problems, we were close to cancelling today. We're going to go for it. But in the last minute, you can see me miming. I haven't said anything in the last minute or so. We'll go back to Byron. I can see a good signal here, so I'll keep talking. He was born in London, where we're going to end up, in 1788. Susie, refresh, and I think we might be okay. We've got a good signal now. His father was an army officer, Captain John Byron. Years later, he was given the name Mad Jack Byron. Now, Jack was from aristocracy, had no access to money in reality, so a bit like George Orwell, seemed to be middle upper class, but didn't have the money behind it. His mother, Catherine Gordon, she was a Scottish heiress. And let's be honest, in all probability, the father, John Byron, probably married the mother just for her fortune. And Lord Byron was christened in 1788 at St. Marylebone Parish Church. And I passed that on my Sherlock Holmes tour. We have around here some very exclusive stores. They're doing some work to Burberry. It's under refurbishment. So young George lived in London for a couple of years. His mother takes him back to Scotland, to Aberdeen, where they live above a perfume shop. The father turns up a couple of times, mainly for money. Then he runs off to France. He dies in 1791. So when Byron is 3 years old, possibly tuberculosis, it's possibly suicide. There's a bit of evidence both ways. But young Byron is 3 years old. He goes to school in Aberdeen. And then, when he's about 10 years old, his great uncle dies. Now, his father was known as Mad Jack. His uncle was titled Wicked Lord Byron. So his life didn't start off in the greatest way. He had relatives that were just as eccentric and as rebellious as him. But for Lord Byron, our Lord Byron, the family, and George, young George in particular, inherited a place called Newstead Abbey in Nottinghamshire, which was the ancestral family home. So he's become a baron and then inherited a lordship. So in this country, or the UK in general, you can be awarded a lordship by the royal family, you can inherit a lordship, and in certain cases, especially up in Scotland, you can buy one. And some of them are quite cheap. You buy a plot of land, you automatically inherit the lordship. So you can be a lord, or as they call it in Scotland, a laird of a certain area. And then he comes back to London. He gets sent to a school in Dulwich, southeast London. Academics who've studied the records, and thank goodness for academics, they believe that he had quite difficult bouts of violence, and they always attribute it to overcompensation. He had a club foot. His mother, he said years later, even during childbirth, would wear a corset. So the constriction of the corset, people in Victorian times and Georgian times trying to be upright, straight-laced, as it were. The idea of a corset, if you were tied at the back, laced at the back, they called you straight-laced. If you were laced at the front, they would call you a loose woman. So most women decided, if they had somebody to help them, to be straight-laced at the back. But he always said that his mother wearing a corset created his club foot. I'll stop here and look at some of the chat. Susan has said that she did a tour around Newstead Abbey with Ian and picked up some interesting facts and did a little research of her own. Susan, don't share any of it. Spoiler alert, Susan. Of course, Ian, a great guide in the Cotswolds and Stratford, great friend of mine. Thing was, his mother took him in and out of school. And it probably, as we would now understand it, it interfered with his discipline. And then between the ages of 12 and 16, that is when he went to Harrow in northwest London. I will send a couple of pictures of Harrow School. Now, Harrow was, and still is, what we would call in the UK a public school. But most parts of the world, they would call it a private school. So the family had class. In some ways, they had a bit of the poor children of the district. Harrow officially, some of them are designed by Decimus Burton. And Decimus Burton was the designer and the architect of the Wellington Arch at Hyde Park, which we recently saw at Her Majesty's funeral, and the Temperate and Palm houses at Kew Gardens. Just refresh. I was talking about Harrow School being like Eton. Private schools, exclusive schools, that we call them public schools, but other parts of the world call them private schools. Decimus Burton was the architect of most of the school. Decimus Burton, if you've ever been to Kew Gardens or you've seen my From Home tour on Kew Gardens, designed the Temperate and the Palm House. The school now seems to house about 800 boys. They say up to 820, and they all live in. Carla said, think you should take me for a hot coffee. I'd like that. But you know what? I try not to cancel. And the rain has just stopped, which means the equipment's not going to die. So I'll just stop here for a moment. Let me post a few more images. You may have seen these before. Ah, here we go. Now they've come up. We've got some images that have just come up of Harrow School. So we have an aerial view, a classroom view. Okay, that's good. I may be repeating these views. Winston Churchill went there. Several members of many royal families went to Harrow, which is in northwest London. So let's say we went beyond these buildings, went about 5 miles in that direction, and we could get a train there. But we're going up New Bond Street. 3 Nobel Prize winners in Great Expectations. Herbert Pocket, one of the fictional characters and a lead character, he went there. One of the great actors in the UK, Benedict Cumberbatch, went to Harrow as well. I did not go there because the education at the moment, and I did research this, is £42,000 a year. And without going into too much detail, he fell in love easily. He said this later on, with girls, boys, and teachers. He started to write, continued to write, had his first volume, Fugitive Pieces, printed when he was only about 17. And it caused a scandal. He was a teenager, a 17-year-old writing about love and especially lust. On family advice, all of the copies were burned. A couple of years later, he had another collection published, Hours of Idleness, which contained many of the previous poems. It didn't sell well, savaged by a few critics, so he kind of gave up writing for a few years. He went to Trinity College in Cambridge, then got disillusioned. He had money, so he went traveling. He went on a grand tour, which is what a lot of aristocracy and rich people did in those days. He went to Portugal, Gibraltar, Sardinia, Malta, Spain, and most famously, he went to Greece, which is where his story ends up. Suddenly, he had success. Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, which was a long narrative poem. He was 24 years old. And it cemented him as what we would now call a romantic poet. So romanticism, in poetry terms, it's not always about love. Romanticism seems to cover, in those days especially, art, music, literature, philosophy. And there were 2 generations of romantic poets in that time. We think of Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Blake. And we think of Keats, Shelley, and Byron. Some of them spoke about nature, some philosophy, some were political, but it seemed that Byron covered everything. That's not me having dentistry work. Simply more construction in London. More and more construction. Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. His first great poem, a long, long poem. It covers the travels and the reflections of, I suppose we would call it a disillusioned man. The lead character, he's melancholy, rebellious, despairing, moody, cynical, lonely. All of those things I felt on this tour so far. Because of the rain and the travel. Sometimes has a desire for revenge. I haven't felt a desire for revenge so far. So somebody revengeful and dark and mysterious, but has an ability for deep affection. We call that kind of character now a Byronic hero. And it's one long poem. And the style of character, Byronic hero, I'm thinking about my breakfast. I had Cheerios. I'm thinking about Heroes. But this Byronic hero has been an inspiration, a blueprint for people like Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights, Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice, the Phantom in The Phantom of the Opera, and Claude, of course, one of the main characters in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, or Dame. I say Dame only because years later, Byron decided to write a poem called Don Juan, which he called Don Juan, because he rhymed it with true one. And one thing I hate in the world is literature snobbery. When people decide that they know better. Oh, you haven't read that. Oh, you've seen the film, but you haven't read the book. Not keen on that. Ada Lovelace, who was Byron's daughter, a lot of people tell me she was called Ada. But Ada just sounds better to me. The most modern examples of the Byronic hero, I suppose, would be Daniel Craig's James Bond, and indeed Batman, Bruce Wayne, dark, brooding, secretive, capable of affection, revengeful. But I suppose if you want to talk about Byronic, Heathcliff from Wuthering Heights. Susan has said, I study literature, and there are indeed many literary snobs or literature snobs. Byron later said he literally, instantly found himself famous. The reason I'm stopping here for just a moment is the rain started, it's just stopped, but we are on Oxford Street. And you don't get many tours in London on Oxford Street because the signal is awful. But strangely enough, for me, the signal was awful back in Piccadilly, where I always get a signal. I was just trying to please myself for a moment. We'll have a look at Oxford Street this way. Janella said very busy. If it was sunny, it'd be crazy busy. I came here in May of 2020 when our lockdown was in full effect in London. I drove through here. We had no congestion charge in London, so we could drive through the West End if we had what they called I suppose, emergency work, or we had key workers. I had to go shopping for my mum, who I know is watching at the moment, and I would often cut through here. And I could hear the echo of my voice. I would just cough or say something, and I could hear it on either side from these buildings. And Dawn has said, I've been there when you could barely move on the street. Susan has said hi to Mum. Hi, Mrs. G, Susan O. Hi, Jared's mum. Her name is Chrissy. She'll be watching at home in Wandsworth, southwest London. One of my biggest supporters. And she hasn't even tipped yet. Mum, come on. So, Byron was talented, popular, attractive. And just as I do almost every night, he slept. And this is a little bit of a secret into my own life. He slept with bits of paper tied around locks of hair to give them a bit of a curl. I do that most nights. Like a rock star, Jonas said. He was loved by many, he seemed to love them back, and in the next few years, travelling around Europe, he produced many works, elected to many societies, became one of the artistic panel at the Theatre Royal Drury Lane, had many affairs. His most famous affair was with Caroline Lamb, Lady Caroline Lamb, who was the wife of a well-known politician, William Lamb. Now, in my research, I realised that William Lamb was the second Viscount of Melbourne. And Melbourne in Australia was named in his honour in 1837. So any of the Australian guides, and we have many of them, would know that. Named after William Lamb, the second Viscount of Melbourne, whose wife had an affair with Lord Byron. Susan is going to try that hair technique tonight. Dawn has said, not heard of paper, just cloth being used. When I was a kid, I thought it was silver foil. I was a big fan of the singer Adam Ant from Adam and the Ants. And if you don't know him, he's probably the only person in the world, when I was a kid, I ever wanted to be. And he would put silver foil around his hair. But other people did it since. Billy Idol was one. People would say that Billy Idol would sleep with a clothes peg on his lip so that he could have the same kind of snarl and curl on the lip that Elvis Presley had. Janelle knows Adamant. Stand and deliver. Now, Lady Caroline Lamb is apparently the one who coined the phrase mad, bad, and dangerous to know. So we're on Oxford Street. This is the famous John Lewis. More a modern building, 1950s/60s, but the site of where Byron was born. Now, he was spending a lot of money. Even though he was born into it, he was spending it. Like his father, he married into it. Annabella Milbank in 1815, married into money. We're going down Old Cavendish Street, just off Oxford Street. I'm amazed that we kept the signal. They had a daughter. Now, I was talking about intellectual and literary snobbery, that Byron wrote a story, a poem called Don Juan, which he rhymes with Don Juan. He knew what he was doing. But his daughter, Ada, A-D-A, a lot of people correct me. And I know quite a few people that have studied English literature rather than acting, which I studied, and they say her name is Ada. I'm going to say Ada for now. And she has become very famous in her own right. She became a writer, Ada or Ada, a mathematician, supposed to be one of the world's first computer programmers. There is a computer program, a language known as Ada or Ada because of her. Tony Villa said Adam and the Ants played their first gig in a bedroom in Muswell Hill in 1977. I was mad about Adam and the Ants. And he was very Byron-esque, mysterious, cool, covered a lot of genres as Byron did. Byron seems to be now unclassifiable. With Annabella, the marriage fell apart. His wife actually considered him insane. She and Ada left. And the untold scandal that he experienced, the divorce, the money problems, the numerous affairs with so many people, not just Lady Caroline Lamb. Byron left England in April of 1816. And whilst he was alive, he never came back. The first place he went was Belgium. Then he went to Lake Geneva in Switzerland. He made friends with another poet, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and his future wife, Mary Godwin, who then became Mary Shelley. And in the summer of 1816, one of my favourite stories in literature history, Byron, Shelley, Mary Godwin, later Shelley, and Mary's stepsister, Claremont, and a friend of Byron, Dr. John William Polidori, spent 3 days sheltering from the rain, which I've been trying to do in the last hour or so. And they read each other, and they created ghostly stories, spooky stories. They tried to create their own. They had a bit of a competition. Ken Russell, Tisha said, made a crazy movie about that. If you don't know the director, Ken Russell, he is crazy. Polidori created the vampire, not with an I, with a Y. And it was published a while later, and it became an influence to Bram Stoker. It was the first book to use vampires as a plot device, to make them Byronic heroes. The idea that maybe Dracula, Count Vlad Dracula, was charming. Byronic hero. The second book was Mary Godwin's, or later Shelley's, Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, and she won the competition. A great weekend. Lord Byron continued to travel. It seemed like he was yearning for some kind of meaning in his life. He went to Italy, He studied the Armenian language, and what I had no idea of, and I knew a bit about Byron, he helped compile an Armenian dictionary. He's now considered one of the leading exponents and scholars in Armenian history. But he wrote continuously. He was making money. He moved to Genoa. He became bored. Somebody wrote him a letter and they said, will you financially support the movement for Greek independence from the Ottoman Empire? And financially he did. But physically he did. He physically went there. And he landed in Kefalonia. And he spent thousands. No connection, Tony has asked, about his connection with Armenia. He just went there and he seemed to think maybe he was looking for something, meaning in his life. He spent his early life having affairs. He had money. He needed to find meaning in his life. And probably the first place he turned up that needed some kind of help, Armenia, he went for it. And it happened in Greece. He spent so much money during the Greek battle for independence, refitting, equipping the ships. But he was losing money. He was a wanderer, Ronnie has said. He had about £20,000 left. He was making money. But in these days, that would be millions, but 20,000 to him was not much left. He wrote to his business manager in England, and the reason we've stopped here is because he was born on this site. His business agent said, you shouldn't be doing this, you need to save your money. And he said, I don't want to just spend my money, I am going to lend a helping hand. He wanted to spend his entire fortune on Greek freedom. Which is an amazing thing to just announce. He gradually realized that people were suffering on both sides, not just the Greek side. And he ended up giving money to both sides, children on the Orthodox Greek side and the Muslim Turk side. So it seemed he was becoming a great statesman, a man between two sides, trying to appease the situation, but he was actually fighting for the Greeks. He was planning to set sail on an attack in Lepanto, which was a Turkish side, and he felt ill, got a violent cold. The doctors insisted on this old-style medical procedure, bloodletting. And his strength, the oxygen in his blood, were failing him. Now, there are some, and many on the Greek side, King of Greece, will never know. But the participation and his death there, it made him a martyr. He died in Greece, and it meant that people around the world were drawn to the Greek cause. And he is seen there in Greece to this very day as somebody that's venerated. He was a humble, a generous, it seems, a courageous man who gave his life ultimately for Greek independence. But in Britain, he was still seen as a naughty guy who had affairs. They were shocked at his death, but apart from the royalty, he was the most famous figure in the country. He was overshadowed by all this scandal. One of the saddest things I've ever felt about Lord Byron, his body was brought to Westminster Abbey. They refused to bury him on moral grounds. A sculpture was commissioned by friends. For 10 years, this sculpture, which had been commissioned by friends mainly, they had paid for it. No institution wanted it. They are St. Paul's Cathedral, the National Gallery, the British Museum, Westminster Abbey. Nobody wanted it. It was Victorian England, and they were ashamed of his dalliances. Cambridge, where he studied, they finally displayed it in their gallery. And on the 19th of April, many years later, the anniversary is still celebrated of his death. They call it Byron Day. And in the center of Athens, there's a statue in the form of a woman, and the woman is placing a crown, a laurel, on Byron's head. She's literally crowning him King of Greece. I'm going to stop just outside the plaque. Some trivia from his mother is he had every fad diet going. He drank glasses of sour vinegar. He made chewing gum made from pine sap. He sometimes would go days eating just mashed potato, cold, binging one day, starving the next. Seemed he had a relationship with his half-sister. She had one child, maybe his, maybe not. He had affairs with actresses, society women, servants, casual acquaintances. This is Winged Figure by Barbara Hepworth, 1963. Wonderful sculpture. By the age of 21, he had cases of gonorrhea, syphilis, and this level of celebrity overnight, Byromania, we now call it, like Elvis mania. His look was just mimicked everywhere. And it was in the hope of catching that curl of the upper lip, the scowl of the brow. So influential. Do apologize. But for unconditional love, he had animals. When he was at Cambridge, they wouldn't allow dogs. So he said, I want a bear. Bought a tame bear. He'd walk the bear around the grounds on a chain like a dog. He actually tried to get the bear enrolled as a student. They said, what are you going to do with that tamed bear? He said he should sit for a fellowship. And in his palazzo in Venice, Percy Shelley later said, that his establishment consisted of 10 horses, 8 dogs, 3 monkeys, 5 cats, an eagle, a crow, and a falcon. And he also said later on that he just met on the staircase 5 peacocks, 2 giddy hens, and an Egyptian crane. Carol B has said, go back to the sculpture. Barbara Hepworth. Winged figure on Hull Street. Seemed to be fascinated with the supernatural. At his manor at Newstead Abbey, the family home, he kept a coffin at one end of the dining room. He used the skulls of the monks who had been buried at the abbey. Not only the monks, his own ancestors. He used to use them as flower pots. He had a drinking mug made from one of them. Whenever he had a party and friends over, he'd make his friends wear long, dark, hooded robes, monks' robes. Oh, and Percy Shelley was cremated before Byron. He asked the crematorium if he could keep Shelley's skull, but he was refused. He really did, Ronnie, like stirring things up. Ada's mother, Byron's wife for a little while, she remained quite bitter towards Byron, and what she did was promote Ada's interest in mathematics and logic. And she thought it was an effort to prevent her from developing insanity. But Ada herself remained interested in Byron despite this. She never really knew him, but she loved the idea of him, and upon her eventual death, at the same age, 36, she was buried next to him at her request in Nottingham. This is where Lord Byron was born. Now, I always think with poetry, when you read them, there are some poems that should be read out loud and some that should be read to yourself. And Lord Byron's poems, I always think people should read them to themselves. Susan has posted an interesting article on the burial place of the Byrons. But what I will do is give you a few of his moments, his thinkings. He was questioned about sexuality. He said, and we now know we would use the word bisexual. He said, women kissed better, but men were cleverer. He went to Harrow School, and he represented Harrow in the first match against Eton in 1805. Don Juan, or Don Juan, is his most famous poem. It takes at least 5 hours to read, so I won't be doing any of that now. Buddy Holly wrote a song about a modern-day Don Juan. It's a satirical poem. When Buddy Holly sings about Don Juan, it's about being obsessed by women, a womanizer, and he can't help it. But Byron says, I'm not a womanizer, I'm easily seduced by women. And a couple of his quotes, despair and genius are too often connected. And he says he only goes out to get him a fresh appetite for being alone. And my favourite one of all is he said there were 4 questions of value, only 4 in life. What is sacred? Of what is the spirit made? What is worth living for? And what is worth dying for? And he said that the answer to each of those questions was the same, only love. We're approaching Oxford Circus. Do not get afraid. I'm sending you back to me right now. Hey folks, I went on a bit longer than maybe I should, but it was worth it. We had a bit of rain, a bit of wind, travel problems. Hopefully we got something out of that. Oxford Street is behind me. More, Tisha said. Oxford Street is in front of me. And we've got lights coming up. They've already put them up. So we will do a Christmas lights walk at some point. Thank you so much for joining me. Do join me tomorrow if you've got time. We're doing a ghostly tale at 11 a.m. my time. And then at 2 p.m. we're going to talk about H.G. Wells, the story of his life. Thanks, Peter. Yeah, study Byron. I think some poets and some writers, they deserve to be read out loud, but Byron is one of those ones, if you read him quietly, it's perfect. Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Tony. Thank you for any contributions. You may not know, it took me about 2.5 hours to get in today, but I didn't want to cancel. Tomorrow's H.G. Wells tour may well be from home. The train strike will still have problems. All the trains are in a different place, but I have filmed something in advance, and I know what I'm going to say. We won't have signal problems. H.G. Wells is a fascinating figure as well. In front of us, where those buses are turning, this is Oxford Circus. You couldn't get any more busy in the West End. Lots of love to you all. Hopefully see you tomorrow. Take care. Thank you for all your support. Bye-bye.